Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
Purim is a Jewish holiday that's unique in many respects, but especially in its geography. Virtually all Jewish holidays celebrate events that took place either in the land of Israel, movement towards the land of Israel, or in some proximity to the land of Israel. And Purim is the quintessential diasporic holiday. It took place at a time after the destruction of the temple, where Jews lived in the diaspora. And it also has had special meaning for Jews who live in the diaspora around the world. There's a common practice of adding new Purims to celebrate events of salvation for Jews. And once again, Purim really speaks to the diasporic Jewish soul. It's about survival in the diaspora. It's about the threats of the diaspora. And it's about the relationship with God that remains in place even while in the diaspora. I want to think about how Purim not only is a diasporic holiday in its geography, but is particularly linked to a special place in the diaspora, and that, of course, is Persia. The events of Purim talk about Persian life, the Persian kingdom, even aspects of Persian culture, like Persian celebrations. But it also, the holiday also took shape within the context of Persia, even after the Book of Esther was composed. In fact, most of Jewish life, most of Jewish practice took place during a period known as Late Antiquity, which begins somewhere in the 3rd century of the Common Era and then extends to the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era, when Jews living under Persian rule, actually at the center of the Persian Empire in Babylonia, put together the Talmud, which is the center of Jewish life intellectually and also dictates many aspects of Jewish thought and Jewish practice. So I thought it would be interesting to think about the role and the sense of this place, Persia, the place that it plays in the lives of Jews who lived in late antiquity, and particularly Jews who lived in proximity to or within the Persian Empire. In other words, what does it mean to celebrate a holiday like Purim in not only in the diaspora, which is the case for most Jews throughout Jewish history, but also in proximity to Persian power, in the sense that maybe we're looking at something that's not dissimilar to what the Jews at the original period of the Purim story experienced. So that's what I want to think about with you. I want to do this in two ways. I want to actually look at two different communities. One community is a community that lived in a garrison town known as Dur Europos, which is located in Syria, in today's Syria. And another community, of course, that I want to look at is the community of Babylonian Jews who produced the Talmud. How did these two communities, who lived either at the center of the Persian Empire, which was the case for the Babylonian Jews, or in proximity to and ultimately defeated by the Persian Empire, which was the case in Dur Europos. So let's take a look at an image that should give us an entry point for thinking about the Jews in Dur Europos, how they thought about the Purim story and the celebration of Purim when they lived in some proximity to Persian power. What we're looking at here is an image from a synagogue that was discovered in Dur Europos. This discovery was actually only made relatively recently, about 90 years ago. And it was an earth-shattering discovery to find a synagogue with such exquisite works of art decorating its walls. Until that point, for the most part, the assumption was that Jews were allergic to art, especially in the synagogue. Of course, since then, we have so many examples of synagogal art that assumption seems quaint. But it was an earth-shattering discovery. And beyond just the fact that Jews were engaged in the production of art, we also find an insight into their worldview, not using text, which is normally how we study Jews in times past, but using the art that they produced. One of the most prominent images in the synagogue in Dir Europos was this image. It was actually at the front of the synagogue, alongside where the Torah scrolls would have been kept. And it is known, for obvious reasons, as the Purim panel. Right? I want to spend just a few minutes trying to decode this panel. We'll come back to it as well later. But I also want to think about the significance that this image had, both for Jews who were living in Dir Europos and also for visitors as well. On the left side of what at least appears to us as the left side of the panel, we have a man on a horse that is led by another man. The man on the horse is wearing what seems to be, and what actually can be confirmed as, royal garb. We know that because in the other side of the panel, where there is a king, they are wearing exactly the same thing. And this man is being led by a man wearing Persian stable gear, the kind of thing, actually Parthian stable gear, that someone who worked the stables in Greater Iran would wear. In the middle of the panel, we have a bunch of figures who are wearing Roman dress and seem to be offering some kind of gesture, perhaps one of approval. And then on the side, once again, we have a king wearing royal garb. We have a woman, presumably the queen, seated alongside him. And then we have attendants behind them. And finally, we have another man wearing, once again, that Parthian sort of horseware, giving a note, presenting a memo to that king. Now, what are we to make of this very richly decorated drawing? I think one part of the panel seems to be fairly clear and really compelling. And that is the significance of the man being led on the horse by another man. This almost certainly refers to one of the most memorable moments in the Purim story. In fact, the turning point in the Purim story, where Mordechai is being led by his enemy and the enemy of the Jews, Haman. Let me share with you a verse that seems to be at the base of this moment. This image seems to be expressing visually what we find in Esther 6, verse 11. So Haman took the robe and the horse. He dressed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Now, not only does it depict that very scene, that very verse, but also the nuances are accurate as well. According to some of the readings and the traditions that Jews had about the Purim story. For example, the fact that Haman is wearing looks like stable gear seems to correspond to an assumption that people who worked in the stables were unsurprisingly sort of low down on the totem pole. In fact, in a midrash that is preserved in the Talmud, one of the ways that Achashverosh is insulted by Vashti is by being told that he's sort of worse and more and less impressive than even a stable master in Vashti's family's estate. Another aspect here is just the general ridicule that seems to be taking place, that the image adds beyond the verse. This too seems to be present in traditions that were held by Jews during late antiquity. We have a long passage here from Megillah 16a, which really goes into details, tells a piece of comedy really about the fall of Haman or the beginning of the fall of Haman from the heights of the Persian court to ultimately his demise. And focusing on the moment in which Haman prepares Mordechai to ride on the horse, and where Haman is really is sort of kicked around and lowered from his formerly high position. Now, we'll get back to the other images in just a second, but I want to also point out something fascinating about the Jews in Dir Europos who built the synagogue in the 3rd century, I should say, and who put some focus into visually celebrating the Purim story. Not only was this image consumed by Jews who would attend the synagogue, who would go there on a Shabbat morning to hear the Torah read, for example, but even beyond that, this panel was actually visited by Persian officials. kind of a fascinating historical relic. Although during the early decades of the synagogue in the third century, the synagogue was under Roman influence. As we're going to see, Persian influence began to be present in this garrison town, and ultimately, without giving too much away, this garrison town would be destroyed with the synagogue along with it. And we have a record of a visit by Persian officials to the synagogue that took place in 255, and they actually went to see this image, and they responded to it. We have graffiti that is written in Middle Persian, the language that was spoken by Persian officials at that time, and this is what they say: in the month of Mir, on the year 14 of King Shapur II's rule, which is 255 of the Common Era, when Hormuz the scribe and the Kardag, the official of the district, and the pious scribe, and they came to this district of the Jews, to this place of worship of the God of gods, of the Jews, they saw this painting. Again, this is written underneath the Purim panel. They saw and liked, something's missing, and we are not sure how to reconstruct the text. They saw the painting. So in other words, right, what we have here is a little bit of a conversation that's preserved in graffiti in the synagogue, where this panel showing an aspect of the celebration of the Purim story was viewed by Persian officials, and they seem to have liked it. Now, the reason why they presumably liked the panel was because the panel must have been explained to them in a manner that was meaningful to them. And without going into details of the panel, it does seem that one could give a positive spin on the events here. The king is seated quite royally, and the Jews could have said, there he is, a Persian king in all his splendor. The Persian queen, or the Persian Jewish queen, is also decorated and dressed quite nicely. And it's not too difficult to imagine how this scene could be interpreted positively, or at least a positive spin could be put on the scene. However, when we think about what the image probably originally meant, we have a different picture. And that requires us to, first of all, look to the other side of the panel. Across from where Haman and Mordechai are walking through the city streets, Mordechai on the horse, we have an image, once again, of the king, of Ahasuerus, receiving, it seems, a memo. Now, what could this be? There are many memos in the Purim story, in Megillah Esther, and I think the best candidate for this would be Esther 9, verses 11 to 12. When the number of those slain in the fortress Shushan was reported on that same day to the king said to Queen Esther, in the fortress Shushan alone, the Jews have killed a total of 500 men, as well as the 10 sons of Haman. What then must they have done in the provinces of the realm? What is your wish now? It shall be granted you. And what else is your request? It shall be fulfilled. In other words, it seems that if this is going to be a panel that the Jews are celebrating, an image that the Jews are celebrating, this is when the victory is being reported to the king. So we have, in its sort of original sense, perhaps, actually a panel that celebrates not merely the survival of the Jews, but the triumph of the Jews against their enemies, including Persian enemies, including foes from the Persian court, like Haman. Now, I want to finally talk about this last element in the middle. This is really a mystery, and many historians have weighed in one way or the other. One interpretation, which I like and seems compelling to me, is by a Hebrew University professor of art history and folklore named Shalom Sabar. He has suggested that these people wearing Greek dress are wearing Greek dress, Greco-Roman dress, because they're there to represent the Romans. And not only that, they're giving a sign of approval at what they're seeing. They're giving a sign of approval at the downfall of this person from the Persian court, Haman, who is forced to act as a lowly stable person and parade Mordechai throughout the city streets. In other words, in its original sense, the Purim panel seems to celebrate the events of the triumph of the Jews over their enemies in the Persian Empire. And not only that, it positions Roman officials or people at least connected to the Roman world showing their approval. In other words, regardless of what the Jews might have told Persian officials who visited them in 255, it seems that they were able to, Jews in Dir Europus were able to identify deeply with the story, the Purim story, by saying the Persians, the Jews triumphed over the Persians in the past, and Jews living at the edges of the Roman Empire also, right, can celebrate this triumph over the Persians. Now, little do they know, in just a few years after that graffiti was written, when the Persian officials visited the synagogue, that the entire synagogue was destroyed. In other words, this thought that the Jews would, of Dir Europus included, would forever triumph over the Persians was incorrect and was perhaps the wrong interpretation of the story. Perhaps the story is not so much that the Jews will forever triumph over the Persians, but there are other messages to be had. That brings me finally to the other community that I wanted to mention, and the other community that sort of weighed in on what the Persian story meant in late antiquity, in proximity, or in this case, under Persian rule. And for that, I'm referring once again to the rabbis who lived in Babylonia, hundreds of kilometers away from Dir Europus, and not at the edges of the Persian Empire, but actually in the heart of the Persian Empire. The text that I want to present and conclude with is a text from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Megillah, which of course is the tractate devoted to the Purim story, the Purim holiday. And one of the questions that's raised in that tractate is why Hallel is not recited on Purim. Now, Hallel, a set of chapters from the book of Psalms, are traditionally the way that Jews express thanks, praise of God at special occasions, right? On holidays like Passover, Hanukkah, Jews recite Hallel. And this is the way that they celebrate and give thanks to God. So Purim, which is really such a dramatic story, such a dramatic salvation of the Jews, why is Hallel not sung on this occasion? So the Talmud gives a number of answers. Some of them are interesting in their own right, but I want to focus on the last answer. And that is of the Amora, of the Talmudic sage who lived in the 4th century, actually within the greater metropolitan area of the Persian kingdom, who said as follows. Rava said yet a different reason. Granted that Hallel is said there with respect to the exodus from Egypt. For in Hallel it says, give praise, O servants of the Lord. That is to say, servants of the Lord and not the servants of Paro. But can it be said here, give praise, O servants of the Lord, and not the servants of Achashverosh? Even after the miracle of Purim, we are still servants of Achashverosh. So Rava is suggesting here that unlike another occasion, celebratory occasion, where Jews sing the Hallel, the Exodus, where Jews left slavery and were no longer servants of Paro, that in a way is sort of the quintessential reason, event at which Hallel is sung. However, Purim, despite the dramatic nature of the salvation, despite the fact that, of course, Jews did and continue to give thanks that they were saved from this terrible decree, their political station did not change. They remained servants to Achashverosh. They remained servants of the regime that initially threatened them. In other words, when Rava is saying we are still servants of Achashverosh, he doesn't just mean we are still servants of a random ruler that is in charge of us. He understands that there is continuity between the Jews who experienced the Purim story, who were also living in a Persian empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and the Jews of his day in late antiquity at the center of the Persian Empire who remained under Persian rule. Now, Rava said Hallel could not be recited in such a situation. But of course, the holiday, with all of its joyous trappings, would be celebrated and would be celebrated quite valiantly by Jews. So it would seem that Rava, and perhaps more broadly, the Babylonian rabbis, thought a bit differently about what it meant to celebrate a holiday like Purim in the heart of the Persian Empire. The point of the holiday was not to celebrate the Jewish perseverance and victory over the Persian Empire, such as perhaps the Jews of Dur Europus interpreted the holiday. It was to give thanks to God, despite the fact that perhaps the political situation was not ideal for Jews. Still, there was reason to be grateful, to celebrate, and to give thanks, even while there's still political continuity.